give us your definition of mindfulness, since we're going to be talking about this in the interview. For those listening, how do you explain what mindfulness is?
Well, there's a really short answer to that, which is, we all have this capacity to be aware and to have that awareness, a bit like a sort of a floodlight imbued with kindness, with curiosity, with care. I think that's the short answer, a very present moment awareness that we can bring into our lives, into our relationships, to how we relate to our body and the world. I think the longer answer to that is, I think it's also about that awareness sort of being aligned with our values. When we become aware of what's happening in our lives, it can be a bit of a wake-up call, right? Because it may be that you're aware of, you're not in a job that you enjoy, or you are in a job that you enjoy, or your friendships are ones that add a huge amount of value, or maybe some don't. So that awareness aligned with values enables us, a bit like a compass, to kind of orient towards a life that's perhaps a bit more aligned with what's important to us, what's meaningful to us, what gives us a sense of pleasure and joy.
Yeah, when you put it that way, I can totally relate. I think in my life personally, there was a distinct period where I became more aware of my life. And previously, I called that I was just living on autopilot, right? You weren't really there or aware. Did you have a similar experience in your life, and how mindfulness changed it completely?
Absolutely. And I have to be honest, in the early days when I started practicing, the awareness made me aware of things I didn't really want to be aware of. Sometimes there'd be some kind of bit of anxiety or some dark thoughts, or, I was doing a job that was very responsible at an early age. And I thought, ooh, am I out of my depth? Sometimes autopilot is actually quite helpful. But over time, that awareness of my mind and body has become like a lifelong friendship. So when I bring awareness to what's happening in my mind, my body, my life now, it's like joining alongside a lifelong friend. My mind and body is here from the moment I'm born to the moment I breathe my last breath. I might as well befriend it, right? What was it like for you when you started to develop awareness for the first time?
It was awareness of that I was in situations that I wasn't happy with in my life. Why am I this way? Why am I doing what other people want me to do rather than what I want to do myself? It's starting to like almost like you're stepping out of your box, and you're like, oh wow, I don't have to be living this way, and there must be a better way. But you're right, the lifelong friendship, it has been a journey, because I think there was a I don't know, like an aha moment in the beginning, and then the past, I don't know, 20 years of my life have been about, how do I love myself? How do I care for myself? How am I kind to myself? All those things.
You really point to something, I think, which is so important when people first meet mindfulness. I think some people can give up on it because they start becoming aware of some stuff that they don't like, right? So for you, going, my goodness, I'm maybe leading somebody else's idea of my life. And that's not the life I want to be leading. That's not a comfortable place to be, right? And then you have a choice. Do I carry on with this, and do I make some changes? Or do I just shut that down and go back to autopilot? And I think you and I both have actually said, no, actually, I want to look at this stuff, and I want to make the changes so that I am kind of leading that life I aspire to.
It's interesting. I didn't think we'd get to this topic, because when I think about mindfulness, I think about just the being present in the moment. I forget that it ties so much deeply into intentional living and
Yep.
personal development even. I think a lot of people talk about mindfulness now in the context of mental health and maybe psychology, which is why it's interesting to me that it was so unaccepted in the beginning for you back then. Tell us, how did that, I guess, melding of your personal, professional life, what did that look like? How did you begin to bring mindfulness to your work?
One of the people who's been incredibly influential in this field, who many of your listeners will be familiar with, is Jon Kabat-Zinn. And he was somebody who, trained in Zen Buddhism and various other types of Buddhism. And he was a microbiologist in a lab at MIT, really hardcore kind of scientist. And he made a decision, actually, while sitting a personal retreat, that he could either go down the route of being a microbiologist and having a life as a sort of a scientist, or he could take everything he'd learned from his Zen practice and bring that into a hospital setting in which he saw an awful lot of suffering. He's not a doctor, but he saw people with chronic pain who had all of the medical interventions they potentially could have and were still living with health conditions. And he thought, I've got something to offer here. And that's what he did. So he developed a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, which has now been shown to be incredibly helpful with all sorts of health conditions and beyond, actually. So the first retreat I went to, a sort of science retreat, was called East Meets West. And John was there. I was a scientist. I was expecting. I came with my notepad and my laptop, and the day started with yoga. And there was meditation practice after lunch. And the conversations amongst the kind of the delegates and scientists was about this kind of, it felt very different. It felt very, we are committed to whatever we're doing. In John's case, he was working in sort of healthcare settings. I was working as a clinical psychologist. But all of this idea of awareness and values and this idea of befriending our mind and body is absolutely central, certainly to the work I do. I spent 25 years of my life working on depression, and depression is, you could almost define it as people for who their mind and their body is the opposite of a good friend, because it can be such a negative and a dark place. And that movement of befriending our body and mind, I think, is a movement towards well-being. It's a movement towards healing. It's a movement towards health.
And can I ask you why you think this mindfulness is so effective, right? I think people who with experience understand, but for people who, they're relatively new to the concept, why does it work so well? Like in helping us deal with struggles, challenges, stress, just all of the above.
It's said that the brain is probably the most complex organ in the body. The mind is incredibly complex, and it's what we use to navigate through our lives. Why not learn about it, befriend it, learn how to use it, learn how to master it?